April 29, 1945. A windswept plateau somewhere in Bavaria, Germany. Sergeant Thomas Brennan opened his eyes to the sound of boots. Not one pair, not 10, hundreds. The ground beneath his cot vibrated with the synchronized rhythm of marching feet, and for a terrible moment he believed the Germans had counterattacked in the night. He reached for his rifle, heart slamming against his ribs, and threw open the canvas flap of his tent. What he saw made him freeze. 200 soldiers stood in perfect formation around his small tent. But they were not pointing weapons at him. They were not shouting orders. They stood in absolute silence, their eyes fixed on him, their hands empty at their sides. Some wore the tattered remnants of Wehrmacht uniforms. Others wore civilian clothes barely held together by thread and hope. And in the front row, standing with her chin raised and her hollow cheeks wet with tears, was the German woman he had given water to the night before. She stepped forward, and in broken English she spoke words that would haunt Thomas Brennan for the rest of his life. In that moment, standing barefoot in the Bavarian mud with 200 former enemies watching him in silence, Thomas understood something that no training, no propaganda, and no battlefield could have prepared him for. The war had taught him how to kill, but this woman was about to teach him what it meant to be human. If you are watching from anywhere in the world, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel. We share stories from World War II that reveal the complicated, painful, and sometimes deeply beautiful side of humanity. Drop a comment telling us where you are watching from, and let us remember these moments together. Now let us go back to the beginning to understand how one simple act of mercy changed everything. Thomas Brennan was born in the autumn of 1922 in a small coal mining town called Hazelton, nestled in the grey hills of eastern Pennsylvania. His father, Patrick, worked 14-hour shifts underground, and his mother, Catherine, took in laundry from the wealthier families in town to make ends meet. Thomas was the middle child of 5, and from the time he could walk, he understood that survival in the Brennan household meant 2 things: hard work and looking out for each other. The Great Depression hit Hazelton like a slow-moving avalanche. By the time Thomas was 10, his father had been laid off twice, and the family ate potato soup for dinner more nights than not. But Catherine Brennan had a rule that she enforced with the quiet ferocity of a woman who had known hunger herself. No matter how little they had, they would share with those who had less. Thomas remembered standing beside his mother on a frozen December evening in 1932, watching her hand a jar of preserved tomatoes to a man who had knocked on their back door. The man's coat was held together with safety pins, and his shoes had holes stuffed with newspaper. He was a stranger, a drifter passing through, and Thomas could see that his mother had been saving that jar for Christmas dinner. When the man left, Thomas asked her why she had given away their food. Catherine Brennan had knelt down, taken her son's cold hands in hers, and spoken words he would carry with him across an ocean and into the ruins of a destroyed continent. She told him that hunger does not care about names or addresses. She told him that every person on this earth is somebody's child, and that when you have the power to ease suffering even by a little, you are called to do so. She told him that the measure of a man is not what he takes from the world, but what he gives. Thomas was 11 years old. He did not fully understand, but he remembered. The years that followed were marked by the slow grind of poverty, the small victories of occasional work, and the gradual approach of a war that seemed for a long time very far away. Thomas finished high school in 1940, the first in his family to earn a diploma. He found work at a factory in Allentown that made radio components, and for a while it seemed like life might offer him a quiet path forward. Then came December 7th, 1941. Thomas heard about Pearl Harbor on the radio in the factory break room. He was eating a sandwich his mother had packed, and he remembered the way the bread seemed to turn to chalk in his mouth as the announcer's voice described the destruction. Around him, men cursed and slammed their fists on tables. Some wept. A few grabbed their coats and left for the recruitment office that very afternoon. Thomas did not enlist immediately. He went home that night and sat with his mother in the kitchen, the two of them listening to the radio while his younger siblings slept. Catherine Brennan did not tell her son what to do. She never did. But Thomas saw the fear in her eyes, and he saw, too, the resignation. She knew, as he did, that this war would not be avoided. He enlisted in January of 1942. Basic training was at Fort Meade, Maryland, and it stripped away every illusion Thomas had about war being an adventure. The drill sergeant screamed in his face until his ears rang. The marches left blisters on his feet that bled through his socks. The cold was relentless, and the food was worse than anything his mother had served during the darkest years of the Depression. But Thomas discovered something about himself during those brutal months. He did not break. When other men collapsed on the training field, he kept moving. When the sergeant singled him out for punishment, he accepted it without complaint. And when the weaker recruits needed help carrying their packs or staying awake during night watches, Thomas was the one who stepped forward. His commanding officer, a weathered captain named Reynolds who had seen combat in the First World War, noticed. By the time Thomas shipped out for Europe in the spring of 1944, he wore the stripes of a sergeant. Thomas Brennan landed on Omaha Beach on June 8, 1944, 2 days after D-Day. The initial assault was over, but the beach still bore the scars of the slaughter. Burned-out tanks sat half-submerged in the surf. Craters pocked the sand like the marks of some terrible disease, and everywhere there were bodies, American and German alike, being collected by grave registration teams who moved with the grim efficiency of men who had seen too much to feel anything anymore. Thomas stepped off the landing craft into waist-deep water that was cold enough to steal his breath. He waded toward the shore with his rifle held above his head, and as his boots found solid sand, he looked up at the bluffs where German machine guns had cut down thousands of his countrymen just 48 hours before. He was 21 years old, and he was afraid. The weeks that followed were a blur of hedgerow fighting, sleepless nights, and the constant percussion of artillery. The Norman bocage was a nightmare of sunken lanes and dense vegetation, where a German soldier could be hiding behind any bush, where a single sniper could pin down an entire platoon for hours. Thomas saw men he had trained with, men whose names he knew and whose letters home he had helped write, torn apart by machine gun fire and mortar blasts. He learned to sleep in foxholes filled with rainwater. He learned to eat cold rations without complaint. He learned the particular sound a bullet makes when it passes close enough to kill you, and the different sound it makes when it hits flesh. And he learned, slowly, to kill. The first man Thomas Brennan shot was a German soldier no older than himself, a boy with blonde hair and terrified eyes who had popped out of a hedgerow with a rifle raised. Thomas fired without thinking, a reflex drilled into him by months of training, and the German dropped like a puppet with its strings cut. Thomas stood over the body for a long moment, staring at the face of the boy he had just killed. The German's eyes were still open, and there was a photograph half spilled from his breast pocket, a picture of a woman and 2 small children standing in front of a farmhouse. Thomas bent down, tucked the photograph back into the pocket and closed the boy's eyes. He never told anyone about that moment, but something shifted inside him, something that could not be shifted back. He continued to fight, continued to follow orders, continued to do his duty. But a part of him, the part that his mother had tried so hard to nurture, began to ask questions that had no easy answers. By the autumn of 1944, Thomas's unit had pushed through France and into Belgium. The Allied advance was rapid, and there was talk that the war might be over by Christmas. But December brought the Battle of the Bulge, and the German counteroffensive shattered any illusions of a quick victory. Thomas spent Christmas Eve in a frozen foxhole near Bastogne, so cold that he could not feel his feet, so hungry that he had chewed on tree bark to stop the gnawing in his stomach. Artillery shells fell around him through the night, and when dawn came, the snow was red with the blood of men who had frozen to death without ever waking. He survived. Many did not. By the spring of 1945, Thomas Brennan had been in combat for almost a year. He had been wounded twice, once by shrapnel that left a scar across his left shoulder, and once by a bullet that had passed through his thigh without hitting bone. He had been promoted, decorated, and recommended for officer training. He had also seen things that he knew would never leave him, things that woke him in the night with screams he could not silence. The German army was collapsing. Towns that had once resisted fiercely now surrendered without a shot. White flags hung from windows, and civilians emerged from cellars with their hands raised and their faces hollow with hunger and fear. And prisoners began to flow into American custody by the thousands. It was in this context, in the dying days of a dying war, that Thomas Brennan's unit was assigned to guard a temporary prisoner collection point on a plateau in Bavaria. The date was April 28, 1945. The war in Europe had less than 2 weeks left to run. Thomas did not know it yet, but the most important moment of his life was less than 24 hours away. The prisoner column arrived at dusk, shuffling up the winding road that led to the plateau like a procession of ghosts. There were over 300 of them, Wehrmacht soldiers who had surrendered to American forces near Munich, and they were guarded by a company of exhausted GIs who had been marching for 2 days without proper sleep. Thomas stood near the entrance to the temporary camp, a collection of tents and hastily strung barbed wire that would serve as a holding area until the prisoners could be transported to larger facilities. He watched the column approach with the weary detachment of a man who had seen too many prisoners to feel much of anything about them anymore. But something made him look more closely at this particular group. They were not all soldiers. Mixed in among the grey uniformed men were civilians, mostly elderly, but also a handful of women and children. They had been swept up in the retreat, caught in the chaos of a collapsing front. And now they stumbled along with the soldiers, equally tired, equally defeated. Thomas frowned. Civilians were supposed to be separated immediately, processed and released if they had no connection to the Nazi regime. But the guards escorting the column were barely on their feet, and the senior officer in charge, a lieutenant whose hands shook with what might have been exhaustion or shell shock, seemed incapable of making any decision beyond putting one foot in front of the other. Thomas approached the lieutenant and asked about the civilians. The lieutenant's eyes were glassy, unfocused. He muttered something about sorting it out tomorrow, about needing to rest first, about everything being handled in the morning. Then he walked away, leaving Thomas standing at the edge of the column as the prisoners filed past. That was when Thomas saw her. She was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair that had been pulled back from her face and eyes that were sunken with exhaustion. She wore a nurse's uniform, stained and torn, and she was supporting an older woman who could barely walk. The older woman was crying softly, and the nurse was murmuring to her in German, words that Thomas could not understand but whose tone was unmistakably gentle. As they passed, the nurse stumbled on a rock and nearly fell. Thomas moved without thinking, stepping forward and catching her arm to steady her. She looked up at him, and for a moment their eyes met. Thomas saw fear in those eyes. He saw exhaustion and hunger and the hollow despair of someone who has lost everything. But he also saw something else, something that he recognized because he had seen it in the mirror every morning for the past year. He saw humanity. The column moved on, and the nurse was swept along with it, disappearing into the mass of prisoners who were being herded into the temporary enclosure. Thomas stood watching until she was out of sight, and then he turned away and tried to focus on his duties. But he could not stop thinking about her. The night that followed was cold for late April, with a wind that came down from the mountains and cut through clothing like a blade. The prisoners huddled together for warmth, and Thomas could hear their coughing and murmuring through the thin canvas walls of his tent. He could not sleep. At some point after midnight, he rose from his cot and walked to the edge of the enclosure. The guards on duty nodded to him, but did not question his presence. Sergeants did not need to explain themselves. Thomas looked through the barbed wire at the mass of humanity within. Most of the prisoners were asleep, piled together like animals in a pen. But near the far edge of the enclosure, he saw a small figure sitting upright, and he recognized the nurse from earlier. She was holding a canteen, tilting it toward the lips of the older woman who lay beside her. But the canteen was clearly empty. The nurse shook it, tried again, and then let her hand fall to her side in defeat. Thomas stood in the darkness for a long moment, wrestling with something inside himself. Then he walked back to his tent, filled his own canteen from the water barrel, and returned to the enclosure. The guard at the gate looked at him with confusion. Thomas said he was checking on a medical issue. The guard shrugged and let him through. He made his way through the sleeping prisoners, stepping carefully over bodies that did not stir, until he reached the nurse. She looked up at him as he approached, and he saw her flinch, saw the fear flash across her face. Thomas knelt down beside her, unslung the canteen from his shoulder, and held it out. For a moment, she did not move. She stared at the canteen as if it might be a trap, as if accepting water from an American soldier might somehow make her situation worse. Then she reached out with trembling hands and took it. She drank first, just a few sips, and then she turned to the older woman and cradled her head, helping her drink as well. The older woman's eyes fluttered open, and she looked at Thomas with an expression that he could not read. The nurse looked at him too, and she spoke in careful, accented English. She asked him why he was doing this. Thomas did not have an answer that he could put into words. He thought of his mother in the kitchen, handing a jar of tomatoes to a stranger. He thought of the German boy with the photograph in his pocket. He thought of all the death and suffering he had witnessed, and he thought of the simple fact that this woman was thirsty and he had water. He told her to keep the canteen. Then he stood up and walked back through the sleeping prisoners, past the guard at the gate and into his tent. He lay down on his cot and stared at the canvas ceiling until dawn. He had no idea what he had set in motion. Thomas was woken by his corporal's hand on his shoulder, shaking him with an urgency that cut through the fog of exhausted sleep. The corporal's voice was tight with tension. He said there was something Thomas needed to see outside. He said he could not explain it. He said Thomas needed to come now. Thomas grabbed his rifle and followed the corporal out of the tent. What he saw made him stop dead. The plateau was filled with people. They had come from everywhere, it seemed. From the prisoner enclosure, yes, but also from the roads that led up the mountain, from the valleys below, from the ruined villages that dotted the Bavarian countryside. They were German soldiers and German civilians, old men and young women and children, and they stood in a vast semicircle around Thomas's tent, their faces pale in the early morning light. 200 of them, perhaps more. Thomas's first instinct was defensive. He raised his rifle, his eyes scanning the crowd for weapons, for any sign of hostile intent. But the corporal grabbed his arm and shook his head. The corporal told him to look, really look. Thomas looked. The people in the crowd were not armed. They were not threatening. They stood in silence, their hands visible and empty, their eyes fixed on him with an expression that Thomas struggled to identify. It was not hatred. It was not fear. It was something else entirely. And then he saw her. The nurse from the night before stepped forward from the front row of the crowd. She was still wearing her stained uniform, and her face was still hollow with exhaustion, but there was something different about the way she held herself now. She walked toward Thomas with the careful dignity of someone who is about to deliver an important message. She stopped a few feet in front of him and spoke. Her English was halting but clear. She told him that her name was Anna Bergman. She told him that the older woman he had helped her give water to the night before was her mother, Helga, who had been a teacher in Munich before the bombing destroyed their home and killed her father. She told him that they had been walking for 3 weeks, fleeing the advancing front, and that her mother had been too weak to go on and too proud to ask for help. She told him that his canteen of water had saved her mother's life. And then she told him something that Thomas Brennan had never expected to hear. She said that word had spread through the prisoner enclosure during the night. She said that the story of the American sergeant who had brought water to a German woman had passed from mouth to mouth, prisoner to prisoner, until everyone knew. She said that in the morning, when the guards opened the enclosure for roll call, the prisoners had refused to line up. Instead, they had come here to his tent to see him, and they had not come alone. The civilians in the crowd, Anna explained, were people who had heard the story from the prisoners as they were being marched through. They were farmers and shopkeepers and refugees, people who had spent years living under a regime that told them Americans were monsters, barbarians who would show no mercy. They had heard the propaganda their entire lives, and they had believed it, until now. Thomas looked at the crowd. He saw old women with tears streaming down their faces. He saw young men who had probably been shooting at American soldiers just days before, standing now with their heads bowed in something that looked like gratitude. He saw children clinging to their mothers' hands, staring at him with wide, curious eyes. Anna Bergman told him that they had come to thank him. She told him that they had come to see for themselves that not all enemies are truly enemies, that sometimes in the middle of horror there is still kindness. She told him that he had given them hope. Thomas did not know what to say. He was a sergeant from Pennsylvania, a coal miner's son who had joined the army because his country was attacked and fighting was what you did. He had never thought of himself as particularly brave or particularly good. He had done terrible things in this war, things that would haunt him forever. He had killed men who were probably no worse than him, men who had been drafted into a cause they did not choose. And now 200 people stood in front of him, looking at him like he was something more than just another tired soldier trying to survive. He lowered his rifle. He looked at Anna Bergman, and he saw that she was crying. And then, slowly, he reached out and took her hand. The days after that morning on the plateau were among the strangest of Thomas Brennan's life. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the American ranks. Officers came to interview him, trying to understand how a spontaneous gathering of former enemies had assembled around a single sergeant's tent without any prior organization or communication. Some were suspicious, worried about security implications, but most were simply curious. The story grew with each retelling. By the time it reached division headquarters, it had become something of a legend. The sergeant who gave water to a German woman and woke up surrounded by an army of grateful prisoners. Thomas himself tried to downplay the whole thing. He told anyone who asked that he had just given someone a drink of water, that it was nothing special, that his mother would have done the same thing. But the people who had been there that morning knew better, and they did not forget. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, just 10 days after the gathering on the plateau. Thomas was reassigned to occupation duties in Munich, where the work of rebuilding a shattered country had already begun. The city was a wasteland of rubble and ruins, and the people who emerged from the cellars and shelters were hollow-eyed with hunger and shock. Thomas found himself thinking often of Anna Bergman and her mother. He had not seen them since that morning on the plateau, had not had the chance to say goodbye before the prisoners were transported to larger facilities and the civilians were sent to processing centers. He did not know if they were alive or dead, free or still in custody. But he could not stop thinking about them. In June of 1945, Thomas was granted a 3-day pass and a jeep. He told his commanding officer that he wanted to see the Bavarian countryside. What he actually did was drive to every displaced persons camp and processing center he could find, asking if anyone knew the whereabouts of a nurse named Anna Bergman and her mother Helga. He found them on the second day in a camp near Dachau. The irony was not lost on him. Dachau, the site of one of the most notorious concentration camps in the Nazi system, was now home to a displaced persons facility where Germans who had lost their homes waited for some kind of future to materialize. The camp was overcrowded and undersupplied, but it was better than the rubble of Munich. And the American administrators were doing their best with limited resources. Anna Bergman was working as a nurse in the camp's medical tent when Thomas walked through the entrance. She was bent over a patient, her back to him, and for a long moment he simply watched her work. She moved with the same careful efficiency he remembered from the plateau, the same gentle determination that had struck him that first night. Then she turned around and saw him. Her face went through a series of expressions that Thomas would remember for the rest of his life. Shock first, then disbelief, then something that might have been hope, and finally, a smile that transformed her entire face. She walked toward him, and he walked toward her, and they met in the middle of the medical tent, surrounded by the sick and the wounded and the dispossessed, and for a moment, the war and its aftermath fell away entirely. Thomas asked about her mother. Anna told him that Helga was recovering, that the water he had given them that night had stabilized her enough to survive the journey to the processing center, and that she was now living in one of the camp's family barracks, growing stronger every day. Thomas asked if he could see her. Anna took his hand and led him through the camp to a small building near the perimeter. Inside, Helga Bergman sat in a chair by the window, a blanket over her knees, looking out at the mountains in the distance. She was still thin, still frail, but there was color in her cheeks and clarity in her eyes that had not been there that night on the plateau. When she saw Thomas, she tried to stand. Anna rushed forward to help her, but Helga waved her off with a gesture that was somehow both gentle and imperious. She rose on her own, and she walked across the room to where Thomas stood, and she took his face in her hands, the way a mother takes the face of her own child. She spoke in German and Anna translated. Helga Bergman told Thomas that she had been a teacher for 40 years and that in all that time she had tried to teach her students one simple truth, that kindness is the only thing that survives. Empires rise and fall, she said. Wars are won and lost. Ideologies come and go like seasons, but an act of kindness, a moment of mercy ripples outward through time and space in ways that no one can predict. She told him that she had spent years living under a regime that preached hatred, that told her the Americans were subhuman enemies who deserved no mercy. She told him that she had heard the propaganda so many times that part of her had started to believe it, had started to fear what would happen when the Americans finally arrived. And then an American soldier had brought her water in the middle of the night, for no reason except that she was thirsty and he had water to give. Helga Bergman told Thomas that in that moment, everything she had been taught fell away. The lies, the hatred, the fear, all of it crumbled like the buildings of Munich, and what was left was the simple truth that her own teachers had tried to teach her long ago, that every person on this earth is somebody's child, and that we are all connected by our common humanity. She told him that he had given her more than water. He had given her back her faith in people. Thomas did not know what to say. He was not a man of many words, and the emotion of the moment threatened to overwhelm him. So he simply took Helga's hands in his, the way his mother had taken his hands so many years ago in that cold kitchen in Pennsylvania, and he held them for a long time without speaking. When he finally let go, there were tears on his cheeks. Thomas Brennan came home to Pennsylvania in December of 1945. He stepped off the train in Hazelton on a grey winter afternoon, his duffel bag over his shoulder, and he saw his mother waiting on the platform with her coat pulled tight against the cold. She looked older than he remembered. The war had aged everyone, even those who had never left home, but when she saw him, her face lit up with the same smile he had known since childhood, and she ran toward him with an energy that belied her years. They held each other for a long time on that platform, and when they finally pulled apart, Catherine Brennan looked into her son's eyes and saw something that had not been there before. She asked him what had happened over there. Thomas did not tell her about the killing, about the death, about the nightmares that still woke him in the darkest hours of the night. He did not tell her about the German boy with the photograph, or the frozen foxholes of Bastogne, or the ruins of Munich. Instead, he told her about the canteen. He told her about Anna Bergman and her mother Helga. He told her about the gathering on the plateau, about the 200 people who had come to see the American soldier, who had given water to a stranger. He told her about the look in their eyes, the way they had stood in silence, the way Anna had taken his hand. And he told her that in that moment, he had understood something that he had been trying to understand his whole life. He told her that she had been right, all those years ago in the kitchen, that hunger does not care about names or addresses, that every person on this earth is somebody's child, that the measure of a man is not what he takes from the world, but what he gives. Catherine Brennan listened to her son's story, and when he was finished, she took his hands in hers the way she had when he was a boy. She told him that she had always known he would come back. She told him that she had prayed for him every night, and that she had never doubted, not once, that the goodness she had tried to plant in him would survive whatever the war threw at him. She told him that she was proud of him. Thomas stayed in Hazelton for a few months, working at the same factory where he had worked before the war, trying to readjust to a life that no longer felt like his own. But he could not stop thinking about Anna Bergman. He wrote letters to every address he could find, trying to track her down through the chaos of post-war Europe. Months passed without a response, and then in the spring of 1946, a letter arrived. It was from Anna. She had been moved to another displaced persons camp, and from there to a resettlement program in Switzerland. She was alive, she was safe, and she had not forgotten him. They corresponded for a year, letters crossing the Atlantic in both directions, and with each exchange, Thomas felt something growing between them that he had not expected to feel again. It was not just attraction, though that was part of it. It was recognition. It was the sense that they had both seen the worst of humanity and had chosen in the end to believe in the best. In the summer of 1947, Thomas used his savings to buy a ticket to Geneva. He found Anna in a small apartment near the lake, working as a nurse in a local hospital. She had cut her hair shorter and there was more color in her cheeks, but she was still the woman he remembered from that cold night on the plateau. She opened the door and saw him standing there, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she stepped forward and kissed him, and Thomas Brennan knew that he had found his way home. They were married in September of 1947, in a small ceremony in Geneva, attended by Helga Bergman and a handful of friends from the hospital. Thomas brought Anna back to Pennsylvania, where Catherine Brennan welcomed her with open arms and treated her like the daughter she had never had. They had 3 children over the years, 2 sons and a daughter. Thomas worked at the factory until his retirement, never rising to management, never seeking promotion, content to do his work and come home to his family each night. Anna opened a small clinic in Hazelton that served the coal miners and their families, and she was known throughout the town for her skill and her compassion. Helga Bergman lived with them until her death in 1962. She spent her final years teaching English to the children of immigrant families who had settled in the area, passing on the lessons she had learned in Munich to a new generation in a new country. Thomas never talked much about the war. His children knew that he had served, that he had been decorated, that he had seen things that still troubled his sleep, but they did not know the details, and they did not ask, until one evening in 1975. Thomas was sitting on the porch of his house watching the sun set over the hills of Pennsylvania when his youngest grandson, a boy of 8 named Michael, came and sat beside him. Michael had been learning about World War II in school, and he wanted to know what his grandfather had done in the war. Thomas was quiet for a long time. He watched the light change on the hills, the shadows lengthening across the valley, and he thought about all the years that had passed since that morning on the plateau. Then he told his grandson about the canteen. He told him about Anna and Helga, about the 200 people who had gathered around his tent, about the moment when he realized that the enemy was not really an enemy at all, just another human being who was thirsty and afraid. He told his grandson that war is a terrible thing, that it brings out both the worst and the best in people, and that the only way to survive it with your soul intact is to remember that the person on the other side of the wire is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's love. He told him that kindness is never wasted, even when it seems small, even when no one is watching, even when the whole world is burning around you. Michael listened with the solemn attention of a child who knows he is hearing something important, and when Thomas was finished, the boy asked a question that his grandfather had never been able to answer. He asked why. Why had Thomas given water to the German woman that night? What had made him do it? Thomas looked at his grandson, and he thought of his mother in the kitchen, handing a jar of tomatoes to a stranger. He thought of the German boy with the photograph in his pocket. He thought of Anna sleeping beside him every night for almost 30 years, and Helga teaching English to immigrant children, and the 200 people standing in silence around his tent in the dawn light of a Bavarian spring. He told his grandson that he did not know why. He told him that some things cannot be explained, that sometimes the heart knows what the mind cannot understand. He told him that when you see someone suffering and you have the power to help, you help. That is all. Michael nodded, as if this made perfect sense to him. They sat together on the porch until the stars came out, grandfather and grandson, and they did not speak again. But Thomas Brennan felt, in that moment, that something had been passed on, something that mattered more than all the medals and citations and commendations that sat in a box in his closet. He had given his grandson the same gift his mother had given him, so many years ago in that cold kitchen in Pennsylvania, the knowledge that kindness survives. Thomas Brennan passed away in the winter of 1989 at the age of 67. Anna followed him 3 years later. They were buried side by side in the cemetery on the hill above Hazelton, and their headstones bear a simple inscription that Thomas had chosen himself. It reads, "Every person is somebody's child." Their children and grandchildren visit the graves each year on the anniversary of their deaths, and sometimes, when the wind comes down from the mountains and the light falls just right on the old stones, the younger ones ask about the couple who lies beneath, and the older ones tell them about the canteen. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Share in the comments what moved you most, and tell us what country you are watching from. These stories survive because people like you choose to remember them, choose to pass them on, choose to believe that even in the darkest times, kindness endures. Thank you for watching with us. We will see you in the next one.